Hello, Mom, over here. We are back with another lecture video. In the previous video, we have discussed the characteristics of prokaryotes, and now we will move on to more complex things, namely the eukaryotes. Now, the question we will be trying to answer is how did eukaryotes evolve? Because I did mention that the prokaryotes are most likely the first ever organisms that were present here in our planet. So, how did we transition from simple organisms to complex organisms with multiple structures and cell to cell communications and able to create multicellular structures? Now, that is answered by something called the endosymbiont theory. So the endosymbiont theory describes how a single composite cell of greater complexity could evolve from two or more separate simpler cells living in a symbiotic relationship with one another. So let's try to make that a little bit simpler. So endo it actually means inside, and symbiont, if you remember from your old science lectures, symbiont means a relationship, a beneficial mutual relationship between two or more organisms. So the endosymbiont theory states that the organism of greater complexity, so a larger, more complex organism, actually evolved because there are simpler organisms who became symbiote and then they evolved to become one organism. That's pretty much the gist of the endosymbiont theory. So according to this, small prokaryotes capable of photosynthesis and cellular respiration became symbiotic with a eukaryote cell. So the endosymbiosis here is that the prokaryotes who are capable of producing energy were able to become symbiotic with a larger cell, creating a new type of organism. So as shown here in the picture above, you have a simple prokaryote, your typical rod-shaped prokaryote with a flagella, became the eventually evolved to the first eukaryotic common ancestor, also known as feca. Now, how do we know this is possible? Like, how do we know that this is actually a possible explanation? Now, if you remember from our first ever lecture discussion, I have shown you the zoom comparison or the comparison of size in terms of organelles and bacteria. And as you can see here, the similarities shared between chloroplasts and mitochondria, they are only as big as a bacteria. Furthermore, the mitochondrion and chloroplasts actually have DNA very similar to that of bacteria, and their cell membrane is also like in that of the bacteria. So the mitochondria and chloroplasts actually maintain their bacteria-like characteristics, which gave us the clues which led to the endosymbiont theory. Okay, so let's look at the endosymbiont theory as a like on overview. All right, so step one, you have your typical eukaryote. So when we say eukaryote, it already has a nucleus, but it doesn't have anything special aside from having a nucleus. Pretty much it's still the same, it's still simple, it still lives off of heterotrophic manner, so living off of the environment. And then comes small prokaryotes. Now these small prokaryotes are capable of photosynthesis and cellular reproduction. Now since the large eukaryote lives off of the environment, it wanted to eat the smaller prokaryote. However, instead of digesting it, the larger eukaryote were able to get materials from the prokaryotic bacteria and symbiosis began. So, through cooperative living, meaning the prokaryotes provided the larger eukaryote with energy, and the larger eukaryote provided protection for the smaller prokaryote, they had this symbiotic relationship. Now, give that millions of years to continue, the organism evolved into a permanent relationship wherein they are no longer separable and they are the same organism now. Okay, so that's the endosymbiont theory. Now, let's make it a bit more scientific. Okay, so we're making this more scientific. The endosymbiont theory, looking at this slide, take it all in, it's just a timeline from left to right. So you have multiple cells here, and each cell represents a step in the endosymbiont theory. Remember, a theory explains events from previous parts of our planet or previous history of life. So that is like what endosymbiont theory is trying to do here. Now I did not see. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I'm pointing at the first ever cell. So the endosymbiont theory starts with the ancestral prokaryote, as we mentioned that all life here on our planet came from prokaryotes, so it makes sense that we should start there. So the ancestral prokaryote, first of all, grows in size, and with that growth in size, some of the plasma membrane started to fold inward, and that is an important step because the infolding of the plasma membrane later became the nuclear envelope or the nuclear membrane and the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, remember that the nucleus, the nuclear membrane, is double membrane, so it's very similar in terms of structure of the plasma membrane. And the nuclear membrane is connected to the endoplasmic reticulum, which actually have the same structure. This gives us clues that the nuclear envelope and the ER used to be part of the plasma membrane, but because of a previous infolding, it became separated. Okay, so looking at the third picture of the cell here, you already have a eukaryote. It has a nucleus, it has a nuclear envelope or nuclear membrane, and it has the endoplasmic reticulum already. Now, this is already considered as a eukaryote because we define eukaryotes as having a nucleus. It doesn't have the chloroplast and mitochondria yet, but it is already considered a eukaryote due to the presence of a nucleus. Alright, so having that established, the next step is having a symbiote. So first step is to create the nucleus, next have the symbiote. So the symbiote, the first one, came in the form of an aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote. So let's break that down. When we say aerobic, that means it uses oxygen in order to gain energy, like us human beings. That's why when we exercise, we call it like aerobics because you're releasing energy by proper breathing. All right, so you have an aerobic. Heterotrophic means it gets energy from the environment. So the mitochondria gains energy from consumption of food, right? So the aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote became symbiotic with a large eukaryotic cell. Now you have evolved the mitochondrion. So that aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote eventually became the mitochondrion, and there can be multiple mitochondrion in one cell depending on the amount of energy it requires. So that species of eukaryote cells which became symbiotic with the mitochondrion is the ancestor of all animal cells. So that's how animal cells evolved essentially. Alright, how about the other part? Well, aside from being symbiotic with a aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote, some species of early eukaryotic cells also became symbiotic with a photosynthetic prokaryote. So this is still a bacteria um, that is able to photosynthesize. So it has two sources of energy: the mitochondrion and the photosynthetic prokaryote. That photosynthetic prokaryote eventually became the plastid, and that is how the plant cells evolved. Okay, so again, let's just summarize the endosymbiont theory. You have a prokaryote which grew in size and then evolved a nuclear membrane and the endoplasmic membrane from the infolding of the plasma membrane. Next, that eukaryote became symbiotic with the aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote, the aerobic prokaryote, which eventually became the mitochondrion of animal cells. Now, some eukaryotic cells already symbiotic with the aerobic prokaryote also became symbiotic with photosynthetic prokaryotes, which gave rise to the plastid and the plant cells. There. So kindly try to study the steps of the Endosymbion theory, and then I will be inserting questions in our BBL so that you can practice. As always, if you have additional questions, you can message me in Teams or bring it up during our class meeting. Bye everyone. Stay safe.